Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good night to
Wa
Malaysia.
alaikum salam.
A very good day to Prof. How are you, Prof?
Yes, this is a early day here. Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
very early day because our time difference is actually 12 hours, right? From
Yeah,
Malaysia to
opposite
Washington.
side of the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Before this, we have also one speaker from Washington DC too, from America, Mahdi Amin Razavi.
Yes, I know Mati from many years. I was
Yeah,
glad to see you talking about Suhrawardi. So yeah.
we also invited him before this on a special lecture series where he
Mhm.
talked also about Suhrawadi that you said. Yeah.
Yes.
So for everyone tonight, we actually have a new series of event that we call as the Wisdom of the Scholars. So for this event, we will be having dialogue with the scholars that we invited. And for this first event, we invited Prof. James Morris, of which actually he is an expert on Sufism and Islamic mysticism. So there are a few questions that I will be asking to Prof, and Prof will be answering me. And after that, we will open the floor for audiences to ask or even to share experiences on the topic that we are talking about, inshallah. So, Prof, I will be asking the first question to you. So, we are talking here about Sufism. Maybe in the Arabic, we talk about Tasawwuf, Sufi, and so on. So, Prof, from your knowledge and your experience of this subject, what is actually Sufism, Tasawwuf, and also Sufi? Can you elucidate to us about that, inshallah?
Well, I'm not going to say what it is and is not, because I think one of the first things one has to notice is that what people understand by those terms is very different in different places and at different times. If you would ask Imam Ghazali what Sufism is, he would give one answer. Centuries later, if we're talking about Mullah Sadra, it's a different historical setting, Shiite Islam, they're going to give another answer. They'll want to talk about Irfan rather than Tasawwuf. But first of all, I'm sorry if for the people who are listening in who are experts, this is obvious, but let's distinguish between what you might say is practical social organizations that are called Sufi, which are the different tariqas, which are very different, and and then you could talk about the teachings that are historically associated with Sufi groups, and those are very different because you don't have to belong to a particular tariqa to appreciate Sufi writers and authors and teachers. And both in the metaphysical domains and in religious language and in practical ethical teachings, the teachings of Sufis are often quite universal, or at least appealing to people from many different historical backgrounds. So I just want to make that clear, is that whatever tariqas I might belong to or whatever, I'm not talking about that area of Sufism, but I think I was invited to talk more about writers about Sufism. And unfortunately, well, I won't say unfortunately, but let's just keep in mind what the Quran says about poets, that they don't do what they say. And so likewise, if you've been in academia as many years as I have, or you want to keep haq in mind, the truth, and not worry too much about the people who claim to be, the teachers and representatives of truth. So and by the way, I always like it when people start asking the questions, because abstract intellectual questions for the classroom, that's fine. That's what we like to see from the students. But life is too important to stay in the classroom. And so or maybe I'm just old enough that I'm very aware of that contrast between what you can teach in books in the classroom and what we're learning all the time, and all people are learning from the al-mu'allim al-awwal, the first teacher, which is al-haq ta'ala. And so I will probably try and bring things back to the experiences that underlie Sufism and Sufi teachings, simply because that is something that everyone participates in, whether or not they've read the books, whether or not they belong to this or that tariqa. Okay, so I think that's okay with you from what I've seen, that you're primarily dealing with the philosophical and learned expressions of Sufism. So I would say just before Sufism in any was a term or whatever, there's a famous saying of the Sufi teacher Hujwiri, who's one of the first Persian books on Sufism. And he said, Sufism used to be a reality and without a name, and then it became a name without a reality. I don't know if you're there. Reza, your picture is kind of blanked out.
Yes,
So, oh, there you are. Okay, you've come back. Yeah. So what I think is, if anybody were to really, in a personal conversation or a class, were to ask me what is Sufism in that sense that Hujwiri is talking about the reality, it's really about coming to know marifat, irfan, this key term, which is like the term in Arabic. It's not formal knowledge, ilm. It's the knowledge of another person, another reality, and our awareness of God. Philosophers can come up with many proofs for the existence of a God or the God. This is some people are very skeptical about philosophy, like Ibn Taymiyyah and all. They'll say, well, somebody read everyone, and he always said they're proving the existence of a God, but Ilah, but we want to know Allah. We want to know the God.
yes, dear God.
And so, but what Sufis, in the true sense, and even before in Islamic history, before we had Sufi tariqas and orders and teachers who were identified as such, take something like Nahjul Balagha, Imam Ali. His works are fountainheads of the kind of wisdom that Sufis are later looking for. And so I would just say that anything that has to do with deepening our awareness, our understanding, our response to God, that is Sufism. I know that's totally general and universal, but it's intentionally so. There are different terms for the people who really have achieved that end and who can teach us. The Quran speaks of awliyaullah. It speaks of a kaum who will come after the time of the prophet. For the title, I suggested in Surah At-Tawbah, I think it's this phrase, Ibad Rahman, the servants. In English, you'd say the servants of God, or the true servants of God, who walk upon the earth almost so lightly that they don't leave marks. But then it says, and then when the people who are ignorant, and here it's jahilun, when the jahilun address them, all they say yaqulunu salam. And one of the things you wanted in this title was peace, and I thought that's a wonderful place in the Quran where you see that peace here is not like the journalistic peace and war. It's about the inner peace that those people who are close to God, who are awliya, that they can convey to everyone around them, whether or not those people are in this world or they've moved to another world, a higher world that enables them to influence us in this life. That's a long answer, but I just hope it sort of sets this table, sort of shows us the different facets of Sufism that we can talk about.
Yeah, I believe that verse that you are talking about is Surat Al-Furqan.
Oh, okay, Furqan. Yes, you're right. You're right. I don't have the Quran in front of me.
Yeah, no problem. I also just searched about that ayah, and I found out that is from Surah Al-Furqan, verse 63. And if you allow me, وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنُ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. Yes, I think that is the verse that you are talking about. And from what from your answer, I can summarize that what we are talking about, this tasawwuf, Sufism, and so on, is actually about God, right? About knowing God, dealing with God, and how this apply to our life. Is it what you are talking about Sufism?
Uh,
Yeah.
you've put it more succinctly, but yes, I would agree with that entirely. And in that sense, we're all potentially, we're certainly interested in Sufism, whether we know it or not, and we're all potentially, what can you say? We're on the path, on that spiritual path. Yes.
Yeah. So, because we are dealing with God and so on, so my next question is to you, Prof. How can Sufism actually help us to overcome conflict and also violence?
Well, yeah, it's odd because let me just say again, this is the philosopher's way of thinking, but there's ways it will not help us. And what it can help us to do, overcome conflict to some extent, is to arrive at understanding, to find the deeper shared human and divine spiritual realities that we share as human beings that bring us together. But you have how can I say, I always find that when I'm teaching students who aren't experts, people who are, the question you have is a very important question for people. And a good example of it is to take the kinds of conflicts that we're intimately aware of, whether it be between parents and children, or siblings, or think of Surah Yusuf, or of couples between husband and wife, or the equivalent thereof. And in all of those domains, we have understanding and conflict. Misunderstandings and conflict. I don't want to get into what kinds of conflicts involve violence and don't involve it, because that is a very dunyawi, a very earthly question about why certain personalities resort to violence. But misunderstanding is the opposite in some ways of ma'rifah, or of true knowing. And so in that regard, to the extent there's a famous saying, whether you consider it a hadith or not is not up to me to say, but whoever knows their self, their true self, knows their Lord. Maybe not God, but Rabb is probably to be that reality which is higher than us. Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu.
Yeah.
And so if you really want to have understanding, each step we take towards a deeper understanding of ourself and our relationship to God also at the same time enables us to understand the people that we're in a state of conflict with. And that is a kind of knowledge that is acquired not just by spiritual practice, but just by everyday experience of the not knowing, the kind of misunderstanding that we have with other people. If I can bring this down to an anecdotal level, I was a very scholarly type kid and student, and did very well, got scholarships and all. But I got married. I came from a village like a kampong in Illinois, a farm and everything. So I didn't know a lot of people, and so I ended up getting married at 18. This is my children think I lived in the Middle Ages because these things were possible. They're city kids. They don't know about the country.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the whole point of all this is neither my life nor my studies gave me much experience of interacting with people except in the classroom or in the university or whatever. And I can remember at that time thinking, well, I don't want to have children. I can't very well be a scholar and write books and read all the time and still have children. Well, I ended up having 4 of my own and 3 in a second marriage. So I had 7 children, and they are by far the best teachers about what you're asking about that I've ever had. And they didn't have to work at it. They just went that way. So life on this earth is designed to teach us to arrive at better understanding of ourselves and of what God wants of us. That's man arafa rabbahu, not just to know God isn't something abstract, but to know at each instant what Islam, what Taslim really is. So I think the the key, there's steps we can take individually, and of course we could get into social and political solutions, but I'm not going to talk about those today. Let's just talk about the first step of this path of understanding of, and avoiding, not avoiding conflict, because there are all sorts of items in life that appear like zero sum, but this ayah of the Quran that you just quoted entirely is talking about where do people get that kind of ability to move lightly through life, so that when people confront them, it says, well, it's talking of jahil is in the sense of not so much just ignorance, but kind of people are wild and undisciplined. You have to have had experience of whenever a conflict or uncertainty or misunderstanding comes up, that you turn, we have what's called tauba, of turning towards a source of guidance, of God's guidance and God's giving us clarity about what we should do next. So it doesn't mean disappearing from the world. The era of Zuhd, Sufis would always distinguish themselves from the Zuhad, the people who kind of want to flee the world and just do, or Obad, people who would just do acts of piety. Sufism is something that involves active interaction at the same time with God and with others. And so I would say becoming clear about who we are and our limitations. You know, there's so many aspects to marifa or to irfan, and one of those is definitely not just knowing what we can do in life, but also being aware of our limitations and the limitations of others. So that's tied to our expectations of ourselves and of others. So these are very practical discoveries that we make in the course of life, in the course of conflict. So Sufism won't eliminate conflict. It will just help us to become wise through conflict, if that makes sense. And you know, so it starts in the playground or at school, and wherever you find yourself, out in the fields or on the streets or whatever. And one of the things that another way of talking about how Sufism can help us to come to terms with conflict and misunderstanding is to take seriously all the injunctions in the Quran, that everything that we encounter is an ayat from God. And what we encounter above all is other people. If you're talking about professional philosophers, the philosopher, whatever, they wanted to approach God through the regularities of nature, the natural world. And that's wonderful, because there's a natural awe that comes from our encounter with anything, whether it's astronomy or biology or medicine. But the key to understanding ayat and in terms of conflict is to recognize that anyone we find ourselves in a situation of conflict with is a kind of, they're a kind of mirror of our heart and what our human nature involves. And so the people who are the most distant from us, who apparently are the most hard to understand and the most deeply rooted in conflict with us, if we could find ourselves in a safe way, a situation to dialogue with those people, they're probably the people who have the most to teach us, because we all have blind spots. Our personality is this thing where it's kind of like the things we know are the sort of form our personality. It changes in life, but the blind spots are things that we learn about from people we're in conflict with. So I know I've kind of taken your question and turned it around so that conflict is not something to flee or to avoid, but rather it's something to learn from. And that's why I prefer to look at how it works in terms of marriage or in terms of parenthood and childhood, but in our most intimate relations, because it's in those relations that we reveal ourselves the most. And can I don't know whether I'm how short my responses
Yeah.
should be. I'm a professor, so I'm just used to talking. But let me just say something. A lot of people, when they're asked that question, think that they have the answer, that
Mm.
they should it should be possible for some group of human beings to impose a set of beliefs and actions and then to enforce those, and that will eliminate conflict. It doesn't. It just drives the conflicts underground and makes them more likely to resort to violence. So if you can imagine a spouse who doesn't like conflict, you don't have to think of world history. You can think of it on the personal level. If they're the kind of person who wants their partner to act a certain way, to believe certain things, and then resorts to violence if they don't get their way, it's obvious that that's a recipe for disaster. And so Sufism is, above all, recognizing and learning what God is teaching us through the people that we know in life. And this is not just in the here and now, because one of the things you learn in life is life's serious lessons stay with us. So one of the things I realized through having children and teaching is when I was a grad student, all my teachers, I just remember people like Anna Marie Schimmel or
Yeah.
Henri Corbin or Toshiko Izutsu, Dr. Nasser. They all had endless stories, hikayat, anecdotes that they could tell. And I thought, where did they get all those stories? Well, by the time I had 4 kids and moved to different countries and everything, nowadays you could just put me in front of your microphone. I could talk about stories forever. So life gives you stories. It's not like I became smarter. I just became more experienced through those stories. And so you can send me to any country, and as long as we understand the language, the stories are there. So that again, I've repeated myself, but I don't think there's any harm in that. So go ahead.
Okay.
Next question.
Thank you, Prof. I believe that you have made your stand very clear. Well, I think I really agree with you when we are talking about violence and so on. We are often talking about on a global scale, but we forget to tell about ourselves, our daily life, and so on. Because I believe that justice, if it wants to be spread, wanted to be distributed, want to be practiced, it must start with ourselves.
Yeah.
For the same of Sufism, if we cannot start Sufism with ourselves, we cannot inculcate wisdom for ourselves. Then how can we inculcate wisdom on a global scale? Is it right, Prof? So
Yeah, well, that's what we call hypocrisy, munafika, where we pretend to know what we don't know. And we know very well what the Quran says about,
yes,
about the munafiqun. So yes, so that you've just put it very real. And it works up in stages. We're each placed in situations of responsibility in life. I mentioned these kind of family and personal ones, but whatever your profession is in life, you're going to encounter the same kind of lessons.
yes,
I just noticed the name of my namesake, Megawati Morris, who just came up,
yeah.
another Sadra scholar who just came up on the screen. So I'll say that's good. I didn't know, haven't met her many
We
years since I've been to
Prof,
Malaysia.
yeah,
Okay, go
yeah.
ahead.
Okay, so Prof, actually I'm very interested with one of your last point that you talk about. We cannot impose our beliefs on others. I believe that there is actually one verse in the Quran where it says that La ikraha fid din qad tabayyana ar-rushdu min al-ghayy. So I want to ask you, how can Sufism actually help us to build or bridge understanding between different cultures and also different religions, to promote tolerance, harmony, and so on?
Yeah, and I think that is. I was about to quote that same ayah, so thank you for mentioning it. You saved me from sounding like a mullah here. I don't have a turban on at the
Yeah, yeah,
moment,
it's okay, bro.
but I I think that's exactly people when they do quote that they don't take it seriously enough. that our discovery of Deen, which is the universal Deen al-Haq, Deen al-Qayyim, our discovery of that, that's not in books. It's not in something we could memorize. It's something that it's the, if you will, the laws of the universe, but of the spiritual and moral universe. And so it was, I think it was how Sufism can contribute there, if I understood your question correctly. And so this is something that we have to, again, if we can't practice it on the level of other, I kind of want to restart my question and say that it's a good example of an area where we often think we know something and we want to teach it by imposing it on other people in some way or another. By just, if we talk enough, we'll convince them. And yet the best hypocrisy detectors are small children.
Yeah, small children.
I'm at the stage in life where I have quite a few grandchildren, I think from sort of 1 year to 15 years old. And in the summers when I get to see them more. And so, because when we get older, we learn to conceal our disagreements and to conceal our lack of understanding, I spent a lot of my life in school, so that's where I think about it, but it doesn't matter. We have that all the time. So what Sufism can do is to help us to be, I want to be honest, but I don't want to express these things just like they're my experiences, not someone else's. But my sense over time of the practice of Sufism is that what it does, it's just like what we should be doing in prayer and our ibadat of all sorts. It makes us more receptive and sensitive to the teachings that are coming to us all the time from God. Take an example of dreams.
Yes.
There are a lot of dreams that aren't particularly important maybe, but we have to learn to recognize and then pay attention to and respond to spiritual dreams. There's nobody who doesn't have those from time to time. I remember one of my sheikhs, in majlises, Sufi sheikhs, people will often, you get people who ask really serious questions that are like with sidq, with real sincerity to them. And then you get the people who said, well, gosh, they ask a question, I should ask something too. And it's kind of off the top of their head. And I would, when it's regards this spiritual dreams or anything else that we're learning in the path, in a way, we're sort of learning to we're learning how God is teaching us all the time. And that is something we never stop learning. It's just that we become more sensitive to it. So I think that the practices of dhikr, of the different suhbah, suhbah is not one way from the sheikh to the students, the murids. It's actually an interchange. And a sheikh who's attentive and all actually is picking up the questions that are not being spoken by the murids. And at an even higher level, the kinds of shuyukh that may not be in this world, but are guiding us and leading us. There again, they help us. We have to be sensitive to their guidance and their teaching. I mentioned dreams, but it actually comes in all areas of life and the situations we find ourselves. So, yeah, I think you better restate the question now, because my answer, I feel like I'm sort of following one thread of a response, which is important, but there may be others that I haven't touched on that you had in mind.
Yeah, my question is actually, how can Sufism help to bridge understanding between different cultures and also different religions?
Yeah, okay, that's what I think. Yeah, so I just want to say that one of the reasons that you had such an increasing amount of theoretical or intellectual writings about Sufism in Islamic civilization is that most of that happened as Islam ceased to be the cult of the Arab conquerors, and as Islam began to spread to many areas of the world where there were a very limited number of people who were Arab, but you had people who would gradually be drawn to Islam. So when you ask, first of all, let's just say that Sufism, wherever we look in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Balkans, North Africa, and then increasing in Sub-Saharan West Africa, Sudan, from Egypt to Sudan, wherever Sufism spread, it was precisely because it enabled a kind of understanding of between people of what who had once been warring or conflicting cultures and societies. As I travel, I mean, I find Southeast Asia particularly fascinating that way, because especially in a country like Indonesia, which is really more like a continent of islands, but
Yeah.
it's huge, that the spread of Islam often was contemporary with the spread of arrival of Christianity and Christian missionaries as well. And it already, you'd seen interactions between Buddhism and Hinduism. So the Wali Songo, for example, in Indonesia, the seven great awliya who kind of brought Islam there and spread it and adapted things like the wayang shadow theater to be a very particular form of teaching about Islam. They're a wonderful example about just what you've said about how, or ask about, how Sufism can overcome these conflicts between cultures, and in the end, overcoming any conflict involves discovering what people truly have in common, the kind of haq that we share, and that process of discovery and mutual discovery can be described as, I say, like mukashafa. It can be discovered by becoming aware of things that were around us and above us that we weren't aware of, or it can be discovered by stripping away, by a kind of intiza, of purification, tazkiyah, of things that are obscuring our ability to see each other and to communicate. But either way, what is really in common is the key vehicle for that is not theory, it's not a teaching, it's individuals like these Ibadur Rahman, ultimately, who already understand that commonality, and they communicate it in ways that that are largely not through words so much as to just the way they are. And this could sound very mysterious, but it's not actually mysterious. If you simply look at the relationship between a newborn infant and a child in their first year and a half, when they're not really speaking, they are trying to understand words, but there's this amazing communication you have as a parent with a child at that age. And it can take you 70, 80 years of living to kind of get to that point where you begin to have that same relationship of communication, which does not need words. I said something earlier about learning about Irfan or Sufism from, in the case, my case, from children. But I'll just tell one story, and I think it really shows the answer, the universal answer in some ways to your question.
Yes.
And when my youngest son was about 5 or 6, his name was Jacob Samuel, and my wife had given him the Samuel part. I given him the Yaqub. But we were just walking along. I was in the midst of a long and drawn out divorce process, and I was making conversation. I said, somehow his middle name came up, Samuel. And I said, Jacob, that means that he listens to God, Sami Allah. It comes from that root, Sami Allah. And he said, no, Dad, I don't listen to God. We have a place here. And he took his hand and sort of hit up right in his heart. He said, we have a place here where we communicate. And communicate is a big word for a kid who's 5 years old. It wasn't a word he used a lot of the
Yeah.
time. But we commune, and he pointed right to his heart.
Yeah.
And so that is the Sufis who are able to make that overcome those differences of cultures and societies and religions and so forth. Those awliya Allah, whoever you'll call them, there's people who are makarabun, who are drawn close to God. They exist all everywhere and all around. They're not restricted to particular Sufi tariqa or to Islam or whatever. They're out there. If you look at people who have those qualities, in my experience, well, generously, you could say that half of them are women. In my experience, it's a lot more than half, but they're not people whose names are written on walls and signed on books and so forth. There are there's actually a wonderful hadith where the prophet talks about but actually it's a hadith Qudsi. I think it's actually God who talks about his servants and how they're not seen. They act and influence the world, but they don't leave a big estate. They're not famous. They're not powerful. They're the people who are actually conveying the reality of God's closeness and God's rahmah to those around them, the Ibadur Rahman. And so those are the people, if you want to know sort of how you don't get to volunteer. It's not like you sign up for that.
Yeah.
You learn that by recognizing those people and then by being around them, and that's by suhbah, not necessarily a sense of the formalized suhbah of a tariqa, but more generally the suhbah of just knowing who people like that are. I had the benefit when I was a child. My father has one of, I think, 11 brothers and sisters, and most of them had stayed in farming in the same area. So I had a kind of Middle Eastern or traditional style upbringing where every weekend, Sunday, we would get together with all my cousins. And so these 40 or 50 people, of all ages. So while 11 kids, and then their kids, grandkids. And so that's the kind of, when I think about those gatherings, and I think about, there was just all of this, it was like our own jam, our own majlis, in a kind of way. It wasn't formally religious, but each person there had a kind of lessons of life, lessons of love that they could teach. And then there were people who were just alcoholic or I'm not saying as a little kid, because this was when I was a child. I'm not saying all of them were saints or anything like that. I'm just saying that anytime you have a group like that, or when you're a teacher and you have a classroom and you get to know the different students, we're actually learning about how these Ibadah Rahman are around us. I've been privileged. Because I teach these kinds of things, I'm perhaps more aware of them than people would ordinarily be in an office setting or in other kinds of businesses or way of life. But I don't think it's really that different. It just takes time. In my case, I had to overcome the idea that wisdom was just in books, and to begin to see how God was teaching people, making people to be wise, or even that they come into this world with a kind of wisdom that they're there to share. And I'll never forget, I think it was a course where I was teaching about Saint Teresa of Avila, in a course kind of comparing Muslims and Christians and Jews in medieval Spain and how they got along. So many great Muslim teachers and Jewish ones, and so it's a time when you had the three religions living in close contact, and obviously with some kind of conflict. We're not talking about the wars of reconquest, and yet many of the greatest awliya of all three of these traditions lived within the same areas within about 200 years of each other. It's a fascinating period. But I had a student who wrote a paper about this famous author, incredibly practically influential teacher, Saint Teresa as well. And wrote a paper that was more profound than the books I had decided to read for the class. And I think she was studying polymer chemistry or something like that, you know. So, and I had this prejudice when I came, whenever I was early on, was kind of forced to teach general classes, introductory classes, that these students wouldn't be interested in Sufism and spiritual
Yes.
life. And continuously I discovered no, their ability to understand these things had nothing to do with their religion they came from or their outward, you know, these weren't people who were going to be religious figures, but everyone learns about how to overcome conflict and to, by growing and nurturing the growth of others.
Mm.
And
I see.
you know, this is, you know, it starts wisdom, irfan, tasawwuf. It really starts at home.
At home, yeah.
And by the way, I've never belonged to a spiritual group where there weren't people in the group who had big conflicts with spouses, partners, or family who were hostile to their participation in this tariqa or this group. I think it's almost natural that people, like, say, if it's between spouses, it's like your relationship with a sheikh in some ways is an incredibly deep relationship, and it's sort of natural that a spouse or partner or parents are going to say, I don't know what to think about this, you know. And I just find that everywhere, and I think it's natural, but it's also a good example of the way that basically Islam teaches us to be among the Rahimun. I won't quote all the hadith, and I just mentioned that one ayah to kind of sum it up. But we have to learn to love our neighbor at the same time as we learn to love God with all our heart, soul, strength. And that is something that we just go through life learning different ways of doing that. And as you learn it, then you begin to see that other people are, if it's not really a ladder, but that other people have different aspects of Rahma that they embody. And this is a way of looking at Sufi tariqas and looking at the literature of Sufism that reveals its universality, because each writer is writing for particular audiences. Each sheikh is teaching a particular group of people that they have this particular gift. And again, perhaps I should say something there. That gift may be musical. It may be as a poet. Rumi didn't have a Sufi tariqa, you know. It's his grandson who created the Mevleviya and so forth and started spreading their ideas. But when you go back to the beginnings of the tariqas, it's usually people like Abdul Qadir Jilani, who might have called him a Vaiz or a Khatib or something. You know, he wasn't the institution of Sufism didn't exist, but the founders of the tariqas, and this goes right down to present day and where new tariqas spring up, like in West Africa, the founders are the people who are embodying the teachings of Sufism, and they're the people who bring it alive for people around them. And then it's just natural that people come together in a tariqa.
Yeah. Well, I believe that your answer is very comprehensive to all to all of us, and I believe that if I can summarize your answer just now, how can we bridge is actually two-way. Firstly, through love, and secondly, through the rahmah. Always say that through the mercy of God, through the rahmah of which that Islam wanted to convey. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ.
I
And I
mean, you're quoting the ayahs, right? That's one I was gonna say.
yeah.
But let's just say that the prophet who's referred to there, the messenger of sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he's the perfect illustration of what I was just saying about
Yes.
someone who teaches. I love to teach hadith when I get a chance to teach the hadith, because people think that hadith are the domain of fuqaha and of
Yes.
ulama and so forth. but especially when you get into the adab and things that sort of we get beyond the ibadat, set those
Yes.
aside, how to do this, how to do that.
Mm.
The rest of them, they're all stories of these individual encounters of the prophet with somebody. Often youngsters will be on the back of a mule with him and things like that. And they'll ask him a question and he gives an answer. So the humanistic side of the prophet is so strongly conveyed through so many of the hadith that there's some usable English translations now, because I usually have to teach in English, not in Arabic. So, but to say that Rahmatan lil Alameen, well, obviously there's some very great mysteries in that last part, the Alameen. What did that mean? Is it metaphysical worlds, or is it different social and cultural and historical domains? Many things there, but the Rahma is conveyed. If we can take Hadith as an example, it's taken in the Prophet's responses to the questions and challenges of people around him. So since you stole my next next contribution there, that next I'm happy you did, and I just want to second that is very the prophet is the perfect example, and there again, it's how do we know the Hakikata Muhammadiyah? How do we know that reality is very much why Sufi literature, Sufi philosophy, and all is very much intended to kind of open us up to our awareness of how immense that Rahma and that Hakika really is.
Yes, I believe that the Muslims actually, if they really wanted to have this really Islamic life in general, they actually have to follow the Prophet. Just like you say, he is the perfect example of everything. Just because Muslim believe he is the perfect example, but they did not practice. That is why we become distant with our religion and we resort to this violence and so on. And I believe also that that you talk about the when we talk about love and so on, when we only love our sheikh, but we also forget to love our wife, our partners, and so on. And everything starts at home. I really agree with you. Well, because I believe that the love of God is actually the utmost thing, and the manifestation is where we can see started from our life, our home, and so on. And I'm attracted where you said that your life is full of teaching hadith and so on. So can we know about how do you integrate Sufism into education? Like in the today's context, we can see that there are academics and so on. So in your personal experience of Sufism, teaching Sufism, how do you integrate Sufism into your teaching?
Whoa, that's a okay. Now I see Professor Baharuddin is there.
Just join us.
These, sounds like most people I know in Malaysia are tuning in here. It's a very, very interesting experience. Well, I think first of all, what I find is useful is usually in a classroom, if that's what you're asking by teaching, you mean what you can do in a classroom. I always find that the contrast between the teaching and learning that I'm having with a large family is always intersecting with what happens in the classroom. But I would say that what I like to do, I never teach from secondary sources, from Kila Wakal, as they would say in traditional Arabic. I always, whatever I can do, I like to, this is why I've done so much translating in my life and continue to do it and explaining, is that you have to get as close to the source, as close to the prophet, as close to God. You really need to teach from proper translations. In the case of using it in English, I'm talking about from proper translations of Quran and Hadith. And of course, you select things and point people in a certain direction. But I always like to have small groups of no more than 8 to 10 people. Some people, I've done it break the class down then into these smaller groups where people can uh, reflect upon what they are learning. I wouldn't say they have learned, what they are learning from their encounter with these isharat of the ayat and of the hadith. And so, and it's so important to that if it's too small, people get shy. If it's too big, the individual contributions of what they're really conveying get lost. So it has to be just the right size, and that will be different for different groups. Uh, you know, questions of gender and all that that you have to adapt to whatever the culture allows. But what is important is when people in a small group share what they're learning, and usually they've had to write reaction papers, write down some of the things that they've learned. When they share what they learn, they immediately have to use stories from their own life that illustrate the truth of what they've learned. It's not like I ask them to tell stories. It's like there's nothing more boring in a small group than abstract contributions. You know, it's the point is not to titillate people with stories or something. It's to actually get to the haq, the truth, the experience of by which they've learned whatever they've learned from the Quran or the Hadith. By the way, this goes for other Sufi writers too. I generally with Ibn Arabi stick to the Futuhat, which is entirely just amazing sets of experiences, rather than the Fusus, which it's not that the Fusus isn't personal, but it becomes very philosophical and abstract when you get into the commentaries, or Rumi or Hafez, Attar, the people I like to teach. It's I'm not restricting it to Quran and Hadith. I don't want to give that impression, but but what people are learning when you have a small group is they learn, not only they get to share what they've discovered, but they get to learn from the discoveries of others. And there's nobody who's not learning spiritually. So I don't have to worry. It's not like there's somebody who sits in a corner and says, well, you know, it's like somebody who sits in a corner and doesn't say anything. It's like somebody who says, I don't dream. Well, everybody dreams. We don't remember our dreams very often. What they're saying is, I don't remember my dream. I haven't paid attention to that. I haven't developed a system to become aware of it. So I think you just have to get people to a small enough group to share what they're learning. And by the way, I know this is primarily a Muslim audience, but you could, it's not whether the students are Muslim or non-Muslim, that doesn't come into it, because immediately they can see that they might be, you know, there are hundreds of Christian denominations. It doesn't matter what Catholic, Protestant, you know, they all have a spiritual life. They all have a heart, and that heart, God's light shines on it. So you can take texts from other traditions and have them read them. They're still going to have, what comes out is the process by which God is teaching them and deepening that awareness. And so I don't have any, I don't think anyone needs a magical formula for doing this. You just have to listen, and usually in any group, when people do this, if they interact for the first time, they're very moved by these writers, be it the Quran or the Hadith or later things. You know, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, again, if I'm wrong, correct me there, but there's the ayah talking about people who are encountering the message of the Prophet for the first time. Well, when they, I'll just say it in English. I don't want to make a mistake in Arabic. But when they listen, when they hear what has been sent down to the Prophet, tarawna ayunuhum tafidu min adam mimma arafu min al-haq, you see their eyes filled with tears because of what they recognize of the reality, haq, of God. And that relationship between words of the Quran that's why I often begin with recitation, so they understand that what they're reading in an English translation is like 1/100th of what it's like to actually hear the recited Quran by someone who understands what they're saying. But that description in Surah Al-Ma'idah and that ayah is true about the ways that people respond to the words of truth and something that they read or that they hear. I wasn't able to do the kind of courses I was teaching, wasn't able to use music nearly enough. But if you are dhikr, if you will, getting recitation, because you can play, and I do play a lot of dhikr in certain kinds of courses, more on Sufism than on introductions to Islam. But the important thing there is that the experience of dhikr, or at least of outward dhikr, because you can't sort of assign people to do inward dhikr, you hope they will, but that experience is obviously a group experience where, when, as the Quran says again, when 3 or 4 of you, 2, 3, 4 come together in God's name, there's a infusion of the Spirit in that group. And so, I started out talking about reading and people sharing the effects of those readings, but the same is true and often more the case with poetry, especially Sufi poetry, or with nowadays you have abilities, at least visually and audio,
Yes.
to play dhikr and to have people participate in a dhikr that's secondhand maybe, but still has a tremendously powerful effect in them. There's, I don't know, but there's quite a few people I've had over the years who became Muslim later on just from listening to the Quran, recitations of the Quran, because it's that powerful.
Yeah, true. I think the verse that you quote is actually Al-Ma'idah 83. The verse goes on with Auzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. وَإِذَا سَمِعُوا مَا أَنزِلَ إِلَى الرَّسُولِ تَرَى أَعْيُنُهُمْ تَفِيضُ مِنَ الدَّمْعِ مِمَّا عَرَفُوا مِنَ الْحَقِّ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا آمَنَّا فَاكْتُبْنَا مَعَ الشَّاهِدِينَ. I think that's the verse. When you share about the people coming into Islam just because learning about the hearing the Quran, I believe I remember about the story of Umar ibn al-Khattab, who
Yeah.
yes, because he did Surah Taha from verse 1 until 5. Taha ma anzalna alayka al-Qur'ana litashqa ila akhir al-ayah to verse 5. Yes, and I think that is so beautiful to hear about that. And I believe that what you are trying to say right here is Sufism teaches us to be just, and to be just does not mean that we have to be equal. It means that we have to know the proper places of things, just like how we implement in classes and so on. And I believe this is what you are trying to implement in your class and teaching. Am I right, Prof?
I would say it's simply what I'm trying to communicate. And the key, whatever you're using, the key is always to acknowledge the experience of whoever your interlocutor is, khatibun, those people you're addressing, and that are because it's wonderful. Ayah, I'm glad you quoted the end of the ayah as well, because aktubna, it's God's decree that they be among the shahideen. Forget the ways that this later gets interpreted. The point is that we all have this shahada within us of witnessing. We're witnessing the ayat. And of course, the thing is, you don't just witness the ayat, you have to use tafakkur and thinking them through, and really, what's the other word I'm looking for? Tadakkur, recalling where those are two of the key Quranic terms about. Otherwise, an ayah is just kind of seen or experience. It's an experience, but to become deeper tafakkur is our part in responding to it. And so the frankly, I've always been amazed in the modern world because I teach in religious studies departments later on. That's where most of the undergraduates ended up going to learn about other religions or about spirituality in general. That people don't travel more, that they spend so much for tuition when they could take the same amount of money and go to the most amazing places and parts of the world. So that allows me to mention that ziyarah, well, let's go back. There are 14 ayahs in the Quran that command us to siru fil ardi fandru. Another was the other word that I was thinking of. So, you know, the Quran, some of them say, see, travel through the world and see how it was, kaifa kan, but also some of them just say, siru fil ardi fandru, you know, to see and witness. And I want to mention that because ziyarah is just ziyarah and hajj. Of course, I'm finally getting to the age where I don't have debts and I can afford to do the hajj. But I'm still, do I start with umrah or do I start with hajj? Because I think something to be said for the directness of umrah when there's not 2 million people in one small spot. But anyway, but the point is that ziyarah is something, and this sira of traveling through the world and looking and probing. This is how we're meant to learn. And you're talking constantly about the conflict between cultures, and let's not talk. I don't think there is a conflict between civilizations. I think there's a conflict between civilization with a capital C and jahiliya, barbarism. But that's one that you find everywhere.
Yeah.
That's not associated with a particular religion. But as far as cultures, personalities, societies, it's so important to actually traveling and witnessing. And nazar is really inquiring. It's not just seeing, but it's inquiring. That's something that we all can do. And you know, it's funny, the word for tourism in modern Arabic, you know, or some other Muslim language, siyaha, you know, was originally one of the key elements of Sufi training. Was you would have that the sheikhs would encourage people, their Marines at a young age, to go out and do siyaha, which meant spiritual journeying, to find teachers and to find experiences and to go to, you know, you could talk about barakah. It's so important in life, and yet we have to, you know, actually, I was going to say, we have to find barakah. We have to learn to recognize it and where it comes. There's a bit of a problem here because professors who do the kinds of things that I read and profess in Sufism, and the Marids people, they're hungry for barakah. They, at a very young age, they're out there looking for it. I had no idea. My family, I was the oldest, they let me plan the summer vacations. And when I was like 8 years old, I would write to the States and get the maps and things. Well, it's only much later in life that I realized I was always taking the family to sacred and holy places of the Native Americans. I happen to come from partly a Cherokee, some Choctaw, but certainly Cherokee background in both sides of my family, mother and father. But I wasn't like saying, oh, I'm going to go visit these holy sites. I was just like, oh, some ilham there kind of said, well, you know, let's go to this national park or this place, or actually sometimes there were historical monuments, but they're also all the battlefields and the cemeteries. And again, at the Zurtum al-Makabir, you know, I was having the family go visit cemeteries. So there's a bit of spontaneous sira, spontaneous safar there for a lot of people, but then there are people who just don't remember how important it is to do ziyarah. It's I don't care what you call it. I've been lucky in life to sometimes take groups both in in Western Europe and then in Morocco and especially in Turkey, around Turkey, on ziyarah trips over the summer. And the interesting thing there is that the people who aren't from the tradition of the maqams, the places we go to, are the ones who have the deepest experience. So if we are visiting Catholic sites in Europe, it was the students who might be Protestant or atheist or Jewish who had the strongest experiences of baraka at those places. And when we went to the Muslim worlds, it was Muslim world, Turkey, Morocco, and so forth. It was the students who weren't Muslim who had the deepest experience of these places. So uh, you may notice a common theme here that's developed, which is that when you take the teachings of the Quran in their root sense back to and take those seriously, not in the acculturated historical sense that people have what they've made of them, then people can spontaneously experience what the baraka and the ilham and all of these things that are so essential to the Sufi path. And so I just have noticed that as we moved along. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Prof. I think this is the last question that I will be asking before we open the floor to audiences to ask question or share their experience. So, from your 50 years of experience in this field, so what can you say about what some of the most promising new developments in the field of Sufism and also its contribution to world peace and so on? Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah. I do. And the first thing I have to say is, as I've reached the age I've reached, I realize how out of touch I am with contemporary younger generations. It's partly a matter of the media that I grew up when books were our only way of contacting the outer world outside our little village and all. So I got very good at reading and interpreting books. But today, in case you haven't noticed, or you probably do, people always, instead of reading books, they're like this, this is their book, or their screen or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm yeah, I I don't I find let me talk about the positive side of things that have changed as we move towards a digital world. And I hope I get the timing is a little bit open here, because I had a student at Exeter, a PhD student from Bahrain was where he lived, but his mother was from Saudi, there in the Gulf, Tehran, in that area. And he was thought he was doing his research for his PhD on traditional sheikh of traditional teaching, but of hadith, Ghazali, things like this in Bahrain, among Sunnis of Bahrain. And so it was the sheikh and student relationships, and his students were in the 40s or 50s. Their relationship could have been 2,000 years, 1,400 years ago, 2,000 years ago. It had hardly ever changed. They would sit in front of him. He would have a chair. They would be on the ground. So it was traditional majlis teaching in a form that goes back centuries and centuries. Yeah. And as he wasn't always in residence, but when he'd come to Exeter, he'd start talking now about things that were happening over time. This is in the early 2000s, as people began to get computers and phones. So the model of adab and of teaching was that these older men, who were themselves ulama, would learn together, and then they would go out, and they assumed that people would listen to them, tell them how to practice Islam and take up their practical questions in their families, in the women, and so forth. So it was a very traditional, but also very limited, I would say, way of what we call trickle-down knowledge from the people who consider themselves ulama to the other people. So people like Ben Baz and so forth. I won't mention all the other names in the Gulf that were important there, but what happened in the time that he was working on that thesis is, as people began to get well, it was a little before cell phones, but they had computers, and a few years after that with cell phones. What people started to do, instead of following that traditional hierarchy of the revered sheikh, then the ulama, and then the people who would listen to them in various ways, whether it be in the mosque or otherwise, people began to shop for fatwas.
Mm.
If you've ever been married, you know how popular shopping is among a certain portion of the population all over the world, you know. But people began to, instead of listening to the traditional hierarchy, they would, and you didn't have to be literate or have a university degree, any degree at all, to be able to get on your computer and listen to the by the way, khutbas or
Yeah.
you know, the teaching, whatever. Or gradually people developed ways you could send in questions and get answers and so forth. At the same time, I didn't realize at the time I was teaching in England, but at the same time in America, the traditional ways of going to church were often replaced, which again had been there here hundreds of years. They were being replaced by TV churches or big mega churches, which were kind of spectacles of, even whether they were televised or not, that you had again this replacement of traditional knowledge from the top down suddenly being replaced by kind of people selecting the voice or the teacher or the guide that they just, they're kind of their nafs picked out for them. I'm sorry to
Yeah.
say. Sometimes it was the robe, but often I think it was the nafs. And the nafs is not a very good teacher.
Yeah.
So, well, it is. I mean, it's doing God's will, but it's not what you want to find in the end. So I think the thing, the the world that we live in now is different in the sense, two really important senses. And one is, and they both have good and bad sides. One is that you can't not be in touch with people from other cultures and other religions. You have to work so hard at it. It's like it guarantees you'll be a member of a small sect. So it doesn't matter what you belong to or what you were raised in. You're actually hearing about Buddhism. You're hearing about some things more than others, but that you're hearing about different tariqas and different forms of Islam. So you ask a student or you ask a person who comes into the classroom, I'm just talking about my contact with younger generations, and they'll say, well, my mother belonged to the Chishtiya, and this is maybe the Pir Vilayat, Inayat Khan, and so forth. But it's not like, therefore, because your mother belonged to that you're going to grow up with Chishti or even a Muslim. It's a kind of, it might look like chaos to somebody who takes previous culture and civilizations, but it's really a matter of we're suddenly in a kind of opened world where the potentials for learning are very great, but they're equally great with the potentials for fanaticism and for ignorance, or jahiliyyah. So you can't have a digital world without those two different potentials are side by side. And so I have mixed feelings, as you can detect in talking about the youngest generations now.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is you actually, people's lives, their careers, their studies. It used to be talab al-ilm in the traditional sense, wala fasin, that was something that only certain privileged people got to go out and the siru fil ardi and seeking knowledge, talab al-ilm, that was something for a rare small group of people, really. Nowadays, again, you almost have to work at not learning, not seeking, that if you have it in you, the resources are extraordinary. And because I felt so privileged to have the teachers that I encountered in life, both famous academics, but also people I would just meet in Iran or in Morocco or places that really marked my life, and Turkey, Afghanistan, the places that really formed me. So I think that I just have these kind of mixed feelings, and I feel more like an observer, but I also realize I'm a participant. For since 2007, on top of my usual teaching, I've been doing seminars every semester at Harvard, not officially, but unofficially with a lot of the best grad students. And now they come from all over the Boston area, and we've done usually things related to Ibn Arabi. That just happened to be something that I found really interested these advanced students in Islamic studies, many of whom are their own professors now. But I realize now there's no reason that I should just do that, and people can come and listen to the recordings. So, but personally, I'm trying to figure out ways that I can take things from whether it be Rumi, but again, I happen to know Ibn Arabi pretty well, so I can pick out things that are good. And instead of translating them and keeping it at the boring traditional university level, try and open it up so I could have films, have
Mm,
people do the readings in connection with films that illustrate what the readings are about. So I didn't even mention that today, but that was probably the most important thing I discovered, and hopefully that people will steal from me like crazy, is that I'm not talking about pedagogical films that teach lessons. I'm about the kinds of films that make you experience yourself. You know, that Quranic phrase, "Ma adraka ma." Well, that's films that are extraordinarily powerful tools. They're rare, but they come from every culture. And in fact, what I found with the COVID was that I was forced to kind of sit and watch streaming things a lot, so that I would find Sufi films, didn't say they were Sufi, but from South Korea, Turkey, Japan, South Asia. But especially I was astonished at a place like South Korea. I didn't think of that as, but the themes, the sort of metaphysical themes and teachings that underlie films and explorations there were extraordinary. So this is something that young people now today have this possibility of learning from the Rumis of our time, I would say, or the Hafezes of our time. And they will, because the language of film, of storytelling, it's traditional hikayat or malfuzat, storytelling, associated music, and and play, working with the emotions that form human beings so much. Those are things that traditional Sufi teachers and Sufi methods and books and zikr were all doing. And now you can tap into that from cultures all over the world when people are allowed to create. And so that experience of a kind of closer connection with ilham is something that I envy younger people, at the same time as I keep telling them, learn to read. Ikra, you know,
yeah.
Ikra, you know, reading is not about literacy. Reading is about spiritual literacy and contemplation. And so I'm an old timer. I'm not from this generation, but I try to learn from them at the same time as to say, look, there are things that we traditionally did in Sufism that are still valuable, and try and find a sheikh, try and find somebody that you can form a majlis with. It doesn't have to be this tariqa or that tariqa. Actually, that's another way. When I used to have students come to me in the 90s and say, well, you know, you talk about Sufism, but obviously you need to be in a tariqa and be practicing. Well, where do I go? And I was very reluctant then. It was kind of hard, you know, because people kind of stumble onto by destiny the particular tariqa that they belong in.
Yes.
Nowadays, anybody who has that question is going to get online, and they're going to find 20 different sheikhs and tariqas. And then their problem is, how do I find out one that's good? You know, for me, and those are two different questions, by the way. One that's appropriate and sound, and one that's mixed, fits their spiritual personality. But that is a very important learning process, is going through that sorting and sieving. So, and the thing is, people of my grandchildren's age, or even my younger children's age, they have no idea what life was like before the digital world.
Yes.
And So that's very strange. They risk being cut off from all the wisdom that's built up in the world civilizations and religions and so forth. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that they're also closer to the directness of ilham and inspiration, and particularly the zikr in all its forms, zikr and ziyarah, which are the two
Yeah.
fundamental features of Sufism tradition. Yeah. So I guess, is that enough?
Yeah, I think that it's very comprehensive from you, Prof. So I think we can open the floor to the audiences. And we from Tradisi really hope that the audience can do have an interaction with Prof. If you want to share your experience, if you want to ask question, please open your mic. Do open your mic and ask directly to him, because here we have a very exclusive session with Prof. James Morris, and please, you can ask questions, share your experience, express your disagreement, and so on and so forth. We open the floor for the audiences. Go on.
I recognize some of those names, so.
We have got Prof. Megawati Morris here.
Assalamualaikum, Prof.
Walaikum assalam.
It's great. It's great to see you again after all these years.
Yes.
I hope Tradisi, the organizer, doesn't mind that I greet you personally. You know.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
I think I'm having some internet problems here, but anyway, I'm still mesmerized by your stories. Can you hear me?
I'm no problem on this side. I can see yourself.
All right. And, so I'm just mesmerized. I'm still mesmerized by your stories. I remember the talk you gave in University of Malaya. I think the interfaith dialogue.
Or intercivilizational dialogue.
Yeah, Department of University of Malaya invited you to speak. And then I remembered you said that, people think that the awliya are the great Sufi sheikhs. And you said that actually they are the kind old women, you say,
well, I guess I was, come on now. Don't give away my secrets.
And then you said, and people, and children who take care of their old parents, you said that.
Yeah.
And I was really struck by that because, well, like, we have this common notion that, the awliya are those Sufi sheikhs, not the ordinary people, like you say, the kind old women, the children sacrificing for their old parents. And that was one thing. And the other thing which struck me was at that time, Rumi was really taking the West, Hollywood by storm. And then, people like Madonna and who else, in a way, they misinterpreted his teachings on love. They just think that it was just at the human plane. And then when I addressed that problem to you, you said, don't worry, about them misinterpreting Rumi, but at least they know Rumi.
That's true.
They know his teachings, or at least they know his teachings. That really struck me too. There were many other things that struck me. So, but I can remember those two. And one personal thing that you told me, you said that you are very much into taqlid. Can you remember that, Prof?
I don't remember your particular question there. No, that's a long time ago.
Yes. So
and
anyway.
Usually I'm in jet lag when I come to Indonesia or Malaysia. So that 12-hour difference is really palpable for me.
No, but really, those lessons really, I really appreciate them, and they have left an impact on me because, in the sense that you bring out the humanistic side, of scholarship, of academics, which and being people oriented instead of being too introspective or introverted and just being more too conceptual and cerebral. So I learned that also. Alhamdulillah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And we both started at Mullasadra, who's definitely on the cerebral side. So
Yeah.
to give away your secrets. So,
At that time, I was too awestruck by you. I just couldn't ask you any questions on Mula Sadra.
yeah. Well, I'm open to those questions too, but and again, I'm not the problem, whether it be Mullah Sadr, Ibn Sina, Farabi, all the great philosophers in Islam, is you have to have read some to be able to raise the right questions, and so that limits your audience. And well, that's what as I said earlier on, when I said that I thought I could, if I was going to be a scholar, I couldn't have too many kids. And in fact, as time went on, I discovered, no, actually the kids are my teachers, and then I can communicate that. So, I as you know, they have the traditional in Iran, the Irfan and Nazari and Amali, practical and theoretical or intellectual spirituality. But in real life, they're they're like that.
Yes.
They are inseparable. Yeah.
Yeah, Prof, maybe you could share some of the names of the films that you show to your students in your spirituality class.
Well, I think it's better if you just email me and I can send you, because you have to, they don't stand alone. What I do anyway is I take really important texts, short texts that teach lessons like, let me just give you one example, because I think this is more general, is a number of the films I use are by Iranian filmmakers, and one is called The Color of Paradise is the name they gave it in English, but it's called Ranga Khoda, which is quoting literally Sibqatullah, Asanallahi Sibqatan. That's the ayah, Bismillah. I should have said Bismillah Rahman Rahim beforehand, but so it's the title really expresses all the interplay of practical teaching and life's experiences in life in that one ayah of the Quran. Now, I imagine most Iranian viewers don't even recognize the ayah that the filmmaker was using, but it's a story of a blind boy. It's a classic. It could be Rumi, from the Masnavi or something like that, or any of the great Masnavis of Attar, the story that's told in it. But the Sibqatullah is dying in this. It refers to the image of our life on earth in dunya as a kind of dying in the fires of this life, so that the fires at the same time, they burn away the impurities, but they set the Asma'ullah, they make the divine names real. So it's like the world is God's carpet, God's farsh, the arsh is impacting on the farsh, on the carpet. And so we're being dyed, D-Y-E-D, by all the experiences we have in life are teaching us that the reality of this Asma. I can't help but think of them, because behind your head on the wall is Asma al-Husna. You may not even realize that, but there they are. So this blind boy is kind of always feeling that he doesn't understand and he can't see things. He's always feeling and listening in nature to kind of figure out what God wants from him, and feels that he's distant from God because of his blindness. So, and then he has a father who's, the film really turns out to be about the father who's very, very far from God and resents him and everything. But the connection between the Quranic ayah, in this case, and the film it's an unforgettable film. You can show it to kids and they'll get the best ones. The best films are often like a lot of, there are things in the Masnavi that you don't want to give to little kids, but but by and large, the stories are very tellable to everyone. And likewise, so that's one illustration. But usually, I would not recommend see this film without mentioning the things and the themes and the texts that we read with it that illustrate it. There's another one, by the way, called Baran by the same Iranian filmmaker. These films, they have a double impact because on the one hand, they illustrate the sacred texts and teachings that I want students to understand better. But on the other hand, because they come from different cultures, they do exactly what Reza was asking the questions about. They actually help the students to see how human beings are literally the same underneath the veneer of culture, that they're literally the same in all cultures and all periods. And a great way to do that, and they learn about other cultures, is by watching these films. There's another one I can mention because it needs a lot of background, but in introducing the Quran, pretty much every teaching in the Quran is present and beautifully presented in a film of Wim Wenders, a German filmmaker, that in English they call Wings of Desire. It's actually the problem is that the film represents Goethe learned Persian to read Hafez, and Goethe's like Shakespeare, really. So he learns Persian in order to read Hafez and understand Hafez. Then his poetry and the Faust and all of his famous poems are influenced by that. And then the filmmaker and his collaborator, who was a famous Austrian poet, they take the film is kind of put together from Goethe's Faust, and then indirectly it's Hafez, and they don't know it. They just know Goethe. So it's a wonderful illustration about how teachings travel through time. But it's a long film and very deep. But let me just say how these things work. The first time I saw it, I was living and teaching at the Ismaili Institute in France. And my oldest son's teacher was dying of skin cancer. So her body was literally falling off her. And I persuaded her to go see that film. The pain that she had the last 2 years of her life was unbelievable. To go to that film. And when she came back and saw it, she said, now, despite all the pain I'm feeling, I really want to live. So it's like somebody was torturing her. It's worse than any torture it could be imagined with the cancer that she was dying of. But that film had that ability to turn her, to really turn her towards all of God's presence and everywhere of all the dimensions of life. So these things they're as powerful as sacred scriptures. They're really, so that's like, I'm not saying these aren't like Sunday school films or films you give to children on Saturday classes at a mosque. No, these are films that you carry with you through life. And that's why I like to at least send something with the film and this text and scripture that goes with it. Because in that case, I've got a whole selection of ayahs from the Quran. It's built around the angels and Adam and Iblis and Adam, about that part of the Quran, that recurrent story in the Quran. And why is it that the angels say they don't want, why is God, giving this amana, the Baral amana, to Adam when that human beings are going to be Jahul and Zalum, And so this film has the answer, as the Quran has the answer to God knows best. Why does God know best? What is it about our human condition that makes us unique vehicles for those divine names that are behind you there for the Asma? So is that okay? So write me.
Thank you very much.
It's if anybody doesn't get, I think BC still has my picture, and I just retired, but they still have Morris FM at bc.edu. So, and you can look it up, I think. Yeah.
Oh,
Or you
all
can
right.
get it, or you can get it from the Tradisi people.
Yeah,
So
yes, yes.
I have two. I have my regular email and I have a BC email, but the BC one I still comes directly to me. So Boston
Oh,
College. I mean, so
I see.
so you can get in touch with me that way. Yeah, I get the question a lot. I just, like I said, I can't. I mentioned two because those two films are particularly powerful. Yeah. Oh, I can think of lots of others. but sometimes the problem is there are certain films that are kind of adults. They're like they'll have an image or two of nudity or something in them that you don't want to be giving to 10-year-olds. You know, at least as a parent, you don't. You know, so that's why some of the most powerful films I know are just so powerful that I can't even use them in a classroom with adolescents, you know, that I'll mention it to people, but it's like any other teaching, you know, it's like, you know, when Nicholson translated the Masnavi, I don't know whether people know that because they may not read Nicholson's translations of Rumi anymore, but there are big chunks where he'll just take the story and translate it in Latin, which is kind of like an R rating or an X rating or something. You know? So only scholars could read them. You know? The new translators, cultures have changed. Nicholson was a Victorian poet, you know. So, but you have to judge, you know, when you're using these things with your audience, and have to be appropriate to your audience. Yeah. Go ahead. Reza probably wants other people to get on
Yes.
that.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you, and it is wonderful to see you again. And
Barakallah.
inshallah, we'll still have another occasion. You know,
Yes,
so.
of course.
Inshallah, we are still open for our audience participation, and we are eagerly waiting if there are any who wanted to share their experience or ask Prof. James Morris on the question related to our topic.
It says Professor Baharuddin is there. I don't know.
I can see his name, but I don't know if he is present with us.
Still with us. Yeah.
Maybe Prof. Baharuddin can interact with Prof. James Morris.
I think he's not there. Well, the reason I was interested is I can still remember for his PhD oral defense, his advisor was Nasser, Dr. Nasser Sheikh, you know, depending on your relationship with him. And
we have Prof. Baharuddin here.
And just to say that I was teaching in Paris and I got this phone call from Dr. Nasser saying, well, we're doing the oral defense now. And so here I am at a public phone in Paris, listening to Professor Baharuddin defend his doctoral thesis. So anyway, it's a strange connection across time and decades and everything else. So just wanted to mention that story. Well, but somebody else is on now here.
Yeah, I can see Prof. Baharuddin still opening his camera here.
Oh, but
Yeah,
someone else is.
You want to talk?
Yeah, it's you need to
Prof.
unmute, hit the mute button. I can't control it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think his mute button is still on. It says.
Wait. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Yeah, go ahead. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Inshallah. It's wonderful to see you again. We were in Kyoto together.
Yes, I've met you. Yeah, not just in the phone in Paris.
It's wonderful. I'm using some of these films. I use Baba Aziz for my class, for my postgrad class. And Baba Aziz, I think, is also, maybe you know, right, Baba Aziz? It's one
Nasser,
film.
if you'll allow me to speak to the general audience too, but Nasser Khamir, he's an artist and filmmaker, Tunisian artist and filmmaker.
Yes.
And this is by far his best Sufi movie. It's not one I've used in my class, but he's come here and stayed. I've had him teach, do movies at Boston College, and he stayed right here in this room.
Yes.
When he comes to visit. I just wanted to mention that he did a book last year on the names of love in Arabic. And I think there are like 68 or 70 different names of love, where he did paintings of each of those names in Arabic, and then took the definitions of them in the great dictionaries, Lisan al-Arab, Taj al-Arus, and so forth, and translated those definitions of those names of love into English and French. So it's bilingual English and French. And it's so powerful because this is something Ibn Arabi does all the time, but to go back to the roots of Arabic words, and they always have these much, it's like a poet, it's like a modern English poet, at least, where they want to be very real and not abstract. And I highly recommend this book. Nasser is Nacer, and Khamir, Khemir. It's not on Amazon. I think you kind of have to go through, but again, since you mentioned Nasser Khamir, I just wanted to say that this man is inspired.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I made use of this movie about Aziz in my class, and I think it's very beneficial. It can be able to make students realize how important spiritual life is, and through the movies, I think it's more effective sometimes than
Well,
reading books.
that's my experience. That's why I was just talking with Megawati there. So yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to notice that the movies are the modern equivalent, those kind of movies are the modern equivalent of Malfuzat, the hagiography stories of sheikhs and what they've done. And they're also the equivalent of all the great Masnavis of Attar and Rumi and Beidil and others, who did these. I never got to the point where I could read Hamza Fansuri, but everybody from your part of the world always says, well, he's our ex. I don't know if that's the case, but I have some Malaysian students now, and I tell them, if Hamza is so good, why aren't you translating him into English? They say so.
Yeah, I think there is a translation of Al-Atas.
Atas, but it's partial, and he's not a poet, he's so he turns it into philosophy, and maybe it is philosophy, but yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, wonderful to see you again, and hoping to see you again.
Yeah, inshallah.
Inshallah.
I'm trying to finish a book on Ibn Arabi now, and I've got an old student who's at Yogyakarta at university there in Jogja. And so if I get off next year to go to Indonesia, as I'd like to do, I would definitely want to stop in coming or going in Malaysia, so yeah.
Well,
I'm not promising. At this age, you say, inshallah, that's, yeah. So, okay.
Well, we're still open for audience participation. Please do interact with our delivered speaker here, Prof. James Morris. We already have Prof. Baharudin and also Prof. Megawati interacting with Prof. Maybe we can hear from Amirul, Muhammad Zul Asri, and also Zulkifli here.
I do not have anything to discuss. I just like to listen. Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yeah. Well, this is, I spent a lot of my, there's only a picture, not a name there, so I have to address you as the picture with the turban, but, whoever you are. I'll say that I spent a lot of my life feeling that way with a lot of teachers, that I could listen, but I didn't want to speak up. And so that maybe I learned more in that state. And also, I also realized sometimes a lot of places I go to where I can understand a language, but I don't feel confident expressing my deepest thoughts in that same language. And that's a problem that in the modern world, it's a problem we often have, that for the moment I've been very fortunate that I really can only lecture, in Persian, Arab, Persian, and French, and as well as English. But whenever I try and speak Arabic, it comes out a mix of Persian and Arabic. And nowadays, and anyway, it's Fusad. That isn't much help for a lot of Arabs. So whoever you are there, I know this problem of language can be just hold you back, and that's one nice thing about these films too, is the ones that are really good, like Baba Aziz that Bahauddin was just talking about, is they don't need, you can have, it's nice to have nice subtitles, but the really good ones, that's why I was less afraid about who was it, Deepak Chopra and Madonna, and what all these people did with Rumi, because at least they could read. It wasn't the fault of the translator, it was the fault of the people who were. I maybe not even be fault, because when people are trying to popularize teachings, there were a lot of famous Sufis who would write in Arabic, which was the language of the learned, but not the language of the people of their culture. I mean, actually, that's why the first people who started writing about these things in Persian, like Attar and Rumi and Sana'i in particular, the earliest, they would apologize for using Persian instead of Arabic. But they said, well, if I'm going to get these ideas across, I have to use the language that's understandable. And English, I mean, Persian for 4 or 5 centuries was kind of the equivalent of what English is today. I mean, whether you went to China or Southeast Asia or whatever, Persian's easy enough that you could kind of communicate in it in a way that you couldn't in Fusha, learned Arabic or whatever. So I admire, and I often wonder at those early Sufis or the early teachers, like I mentioned the Wali Sangha, but they're just part of the team. Whenever you go to any part of the Muslim world and you go and look for places for ziyarah, where people are going for ziyarah, very often it's the people who brought Islam to that part of what we now think of as the Muslim world. But they had to come, they had to speak the language of ordinary people, and they had to make that clear to them. And when I was taking students from Oberlin to places in Western Europe, again, most of the big pilgrimage sites were the sites of people who had brought, they had pagan religions, and the people who had brought Christianity to those regions. They didn't set out to be saints and have shrines. They were just the people who were trying to teach these infinitely valuable teachings to people and to make them understand what they were saying. So that's a problem of the world to come. I often think in the world where you must feel this even more in Malaysia, but I sort of think I'm in this nice window when I was able to use English thanks to the horrors of the British Empire. You can still use English all over the world, but I would tell my grandkids, learn Chinese. You don't know, if things go the way they go with empires, then you don't have to look too far ahead to think that it may be useful to. I'm sorry, I know this is a sensitive subject in Malaysia. I'm not talking about your situation, but just the world we're living in. It's kind of a strange relic of the British Empire that people communicate now all around the world in English, but 2 centuries ago they did it in French for a while, and and before that in Persian all over the Islamic world. So, but okay, I'm off on a tangent, and I probably said something that's politically incorrect in the Malaysian context too. But the one thing when I came and I do these seminars, sometimes it was a lecture tour, sometimes we did some seminars at the Azizan's Institute for Comparative Civilizational Studies. And it always troubled me that the struggles of some of the people who were Chinese Muslims, very sincere and devout Muslims, and kind of had to struggle with the, all the tensions around those identities, and which are, not Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. People have to, understandably, it's not easy when people's categories are one way. And I kind of grew up with that, identifying with my Native American, if you could see me at 6 or 7, I went around with just barefoot and a loincloth. I would visit my relatives in the South, and I would try and dress like an Indian. I don't think I have a set of pictures here, but yeah, I don't. No, I don't have them here. But I got very early, what I'm saying is very early on in life, this kind of mix of identities and language and historical things. This was something that I had my own way of dealing with it as a little kid, and probably that made it very exciting to get to university and start traveling and learning about other parts of the world, because it was only, I went to Iran, spent several years there, wonderful, important years. And then I came back. I thought, wow, Kurdistan looks just like the southwest of America. I felt so at home in Khorasan and Kurdistan and these natural, more traditional areas of Iran. And then when I came back to America, I thought, wow, these are the places I was a little kid, the kinds of American Indian, Native American places that it was like I was going home when I went to Iran, because the ecology, the culture, the way people lived and everything was so much like the Native American cultures of the American Southwest and the Rockies.
I think with a really sad heart, I need to announce that we need to stop the Q&A session and also the interaction session. But before we end this event, I think we need the last piece of advice from you, Prof. James Morris, especially to our young generations, and also that is particularly and generally for all Muslims, and who are interested to know more about Sufism, about Tasawwuf, and so on. Maybe your last piece of advice for us.
Well, you just listened to me give lots and lots of pieces. So I wonder if this is a Southeast Asian custom, because the first time I went to Indonesia, it was the British Council sent me. It was right after 9/11, and so I got to go to Medan and a few places, Sumatra. And the fellow who was my guide and translator at the end, as we went to the airport, he said, "Okay, now can you give me a last piece of advice like this?" and so and I think I'm going to mention what he mentioned, but I need to put it in that context. Is that trust? Well, first of all, I think it doesn't matter whether you're a scholar or young or old or any age, you have to trust your intuitions and act upon them. We're so programmed. It's not a false word. In the modern world, we're programmed from outside sources. To the extent that we pay attention to these little objects, there's grains and all, we're constantly being bombarded with something from outside. But the teaching of the Quran and the Hadith, above all, is that we have to, it's like the story I told about my son, we have to listen for God or communicate with God. And one way of summarizing that is some slogan they gave us for traffic safety in schools. It was drilled into us, which was very simple: stop, look, and listen. And I think in life, if we stop means take time for prayer, and for whenever we encounter something that's valuable, don't rush by it. Don't let life pass us by. There are points where we're meant to stop. They're being sent to us. Those lessons are being sent to us to stop. And it may be, I at a different time and for a different audience, I would talk about books, but you can stop, look, and listen with books, but you can also do it with the world of nature, with our work, with our families. Look, I mentioned Siru fil Ardi Fandarum. Look doesn't, it means that Nadar and Tafakkur in the Quran are the two words that are most applied to what we do with ayat. So we have to, if we stop, but we don't look, we're not learning. So, and then listen means that prayers aren't, we do words in prayer in order to be put in a state to listen. But there, again, this is a huge theme of the Quran about istajaba and ijaba, that we seek. It's the Quran is always talking about God's teaching us, and then our jawab, or our trying for something, praying for something, and then there's a jawab. So listening means to be receptive to the response that comes back to us, as we all know, and every Sufi teacher says it comes back to us from every direction, from inside, outside, and so forth. So the way to remember those things, as I told this wonderful Pak, whatever his name, Pak Razak, I think, but I could be wrong, who was 20 years ago showing me around Indonesia for that tour, was on the way to the airport, I just said, stop, look, and listen. And I don't mind repeating myself because it still seems very relevant.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think it's very comprehensive of the advice that you give to us, and everything that you have told us, your stories, your experiences, and so on. I believe that the audiences are very grateful to hear about that, and it is actually very insightful to hear from a wise scholar like you. And I believe that everyone benefited greatly from your talk, from your answer to my question that I have asked you, and they will be more interested to know more about Sufism, Tasawwuf, and so on. And in more specific wording that I can say, to know more about life in line with what the Quran and Hadith are trying to tell us.
Yeah. Could I just mention one thing is send me when you get the recording up, please send me access to it so I can share it with friends. And I sent you the link to all of the, most of my published writings.
Yeah, okay.
At Boston College Digital Scholarship, it's open, it's accessible, so anybody can go there and see the whole list of,
all right.
Maybe too many writings, my wife would say, but but anyway, they're freely accessible there, and they're all pretty much all in English, and so I'll try and keep that up now that I'm retired. I'll continue to add writings to that as they come out.
Okay, inshallah. I will after this we will send the recording to you, and after that we will distribute your writings and also your suggestion. I think you should also include the suggestion of movies.
I'll try and do that in a form. It's kind of messy because it's embedded in syllabi for courses, but I'll see if I can do it in a form that you could put up to share. And I'll definitely send it to Meg. Well, I need your email, so you need to email me, so I'll know how to send it back to you, Megawati. Yeah.
Okay, inshallah. Later on, I will message Dr. Prof. Megawati on the email by Prof. James Morris email, inshallah. All right. I think that's the end for this event. I would like to, as a representative of Tradisi, I would like to thank all of you, the audiences, for your willingness to join our conversation today with one of the wisest scholars, I believe, in contemporary world, Prof. James Morris. And for Prof. James Morris, we would like to thank you very, very much for your willingness and kindness to share with us your advices, your insight, your stories, your experiences, of which I cannot describe how beneficial it is for us. So I would like to end our session with Wallahul muwafiq ila aqwamit tariq. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And thank you very much, everyone.
Barakallahu fik.
وإياك. Inshallah.
Another way to say thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, everyone. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.